On any battlefield, military commanders face the problem of moving their troops quickly and safely to the front line. Whilst tanks slug it out from a distance, it's the armoured infantry fighting vehicles that deliver personnel to the centre of the combat zone and ultimately help to win the battle. Now, Top 10 will test, assess and grade the most feared and powerful fighting infantry vehicles in military history. For almost a century, hundreds of armoured fighting vehicles have been designed and built to make their way through the battlefield, deliver troops into the action, and then get them back safely. Based on scientific analysis, expert opinion, audience polls, and technical comparison, we've constructed a 5-point matrix that will rank the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles of all time. First up, a vehicle that is fast becoming an icon of the American land forces. The Humvee M1114. Manufacturer, AM General. Power plant, General Motors 190 horsepower diesel engine. Max speed, 125 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, driver and 3 troops. Armor, classified. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun. Range, 443 kilometers. In the late 1970s, a call went out from the US military to develop a vehicle to replace the much-loved and ubiquitous Army Jeep.
The Jeep was a general-purpose vehicle. You could drive around in it, and you could move stuff around in it. But the platform was old, and the US Armed Forces decided it needed something new. And they did a study, and they thought about what they really needed in a quarter-ton truck, which is pretty much what a Jeep is.
Answering the call, AM General introduced their high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, or Humvee, in 1980. The US military was so impressed, they ordered 60,000 of them. And in 1985, the Humvee went into service. But along the way, the world had changed, and so had the Humvee. By then, it was available in 12 different configurations, from armoured carrier to special operations vehicle, from missile platform to recoilless rifle vehicle, from ambulance to reconnaissance unit. But was the Humvee being stretched too far?
This certainly wasn't intended to be an armored vehicle in any sense of the word, but necessity being the mother of invention, it found itself in that role, which I think it's doing okay at, depending on who has modified the vehicle and what way it's been modified.
The Humvee, like its parallel vehicles in other militaries, was designed for peacetime or post-conflict peaceful stability operations, not for an insurgency. For a 360-degree war of the cities, of insurgents, we've now decided that everything has to be armored, and the Humvee is struggling to react to that reality.
Despite this, with a low center of gravity that can take it over most terrain, a top speed of 126 kilometers per hour, and the capacity to carry 1 crew member and 3 troops over a range of 440 kilometers, the Humvee is a tough vehicle that's proved its worth. It has seen service in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Criticized by some for its vulnerability, the Humvee's versatility has led to its use in situations which typically call for much more heavily armed and armored vehicles.
I'm worried about its survivability. It's being forced into roles that it wasn't designed for. It was basically an end of the 20th century Jeep. It's now being classed as something else, but if you're going to use it for warfighting roles, you've got to put a lot of armor on the sides, the roof, particularly on the belly for mines.
The Humvee has earned its worldwide reputation for reliability, and with over 160,000 units built, which have been sold to over 36 countries, its production rating is strong. Marks for innovation are also good. Because of its shortcomings in action, its service length lets it down, as does its mobility rating and carrying capability. But the Humvee is certainly good enough to earn 10th place on our top 10 infantry fighting vehicles list. Up next, an amphibious carrier that ferried Allied troops onto the beaches throughout the Pacific War. And a British World War II machine with the distinction of being the oldest and smallest vehicle on our list. Wars are fought and won by individuals. But without adequately armed and armored machinery, soldiers could never make it to the front lines. Continuing on with our countdown of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. This next vehicle may seem like the odd man out on our list, but it had a key role in the Allied victory of World War II. The LVT-4 Alligator. Manufacturer, Food Machinery Corporation. Power plant, one Continental 250 horsepower radial petrol engine. Maximum speed, 40 kilometers per hour on land, 11 kilometers per hour on water. Carrying capacity, 6 crew and 30 troops. Armor, 1.3 centimeters. Armament, 2.50 caliber and 2.30 caliber machine guns. Range, 480 kilometers on road, 120 kilometers on water. Known as amphibious tractors, or Amtraks for short, LVTs were the backbone for the US Marine landings during the long and bloody campaigns of the Pacific War. But the original idea of an amphibious landing craft came not from America, but from Japan.
The only people at the beginning of the Second World War who had purpose-built amphibious assault equipment were the Japanese. As an island nation, the Japanese understood that they would have to, in a modern war, conduct amphibious operations. And it is, in fact, the Japanese who invent modern amphibious landing equipment.
By mid-1943, Allied forces were trying to win back the Japanese-held islands of the Pacific. American commanders knew that to get their troops safely onto the beaches, they would need an effective armored transport vehicle. They already had the Higgins boat, but they needed more than a mere landing craft.
To any American planner who has got to look at the idea of getting across the vast blue Pacific Ocean to get anywhere near the Japanese home islands, you want to be able to take a tracked tin can full of Marines and put it on shore and allow them to operate without depending on yet another piece of equipment.
The answer was the LVT Mark IV. Introduced in 1944, this innovative vehicle had a rear door from which either a jeep or gun could be unloaded. But more importantly, it could carry its crew safely beyond the shoreline.
Having a vehicle that wouldn't simply land on the beach, drop the bow, and have everybody run out into harm's way, but actually go onto the beach, transition onto land, provide a platform from which you could actually fight, as well as protection for the squad on board, was a real revolutionary change in amphibious warfare.
And with a range of onboard armaments, anything from 50 caliber machine guns to 75mm howitzers, the LVT had plenty of firepower to protect its 30 disembarking troops.
The LVTs worked in teams, where they were almost miniature armies, if you will, where they put artillery in and then softened up the target, followed by infantrymen. And they even had repair LVTs, which were outfitted with winches and could conduct major repairs on the beach. And they would simply go from island to island to island, clearing out the Japanese.
For innovation, this amphibious original earns top marks. And with over 1,900 LVT-4s built, its production score is strong, as is its carrying capability. But marks for service length and mobility are down. So the LVT-4 comes in at 9th place on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. This next personnel carrier shielded thousands of American troops during World War II and hasn't stopped moving since. The M3 half-track. Manufacturer, White Motor Company. Power plant, White 147 horsepower petrol engine. Max speed, 72 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 11 troops. Armor, 1.3 centimeters. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun. Range, 290 kilometers. Inspired by a 1931 French design, the basic M3 went into service in 1941. Used throughout the US Army, each motorized infantry battalion maintained 62 M3s.
Everybody loved it, and for good reason. An incredibly robust vehicle, very well made, powered front axle, very important in a APC or anything having cross-country capabilities. Had a banded track, so there's no links to brake. There's actually just a big rubber band encasing 2 steel cables.
Capable of carrying 1 crew member and 12 troops over any terrain, and with a top speed of 72 kilometers per hour, the M3 quickly won favor with American commanders.
What had been clearly learned early in World War II, and is probably the dominant lesson of armored warfare of the last 50, 60 years, is that you have to have infantry along with your tanks. Tanks look big and bad, you separate them from the infantry, and they're sitting ducks.
By the end of the Second World War, over 40,000 M3 half-tracks had been produced in a variety of configurations. From personnel carrier to artillery tractor to communications vehicle. Wherever American troops went, they took the M3. But the M3's story doesn't end there. An upgraded version with 4 adjoined 50 caliber machine guns was used extensively during the Korean War and incredibly is still going strong.
The Israelis still use the M3 half-track today. And you can drive around northern Israel and see parking lots that are absolutely full of M3 half-tracks. And it's not because the Israelis don't have other battle taxis, because they do. But the Israelis, to this day, use the American M3 half-track of the Second World War as a mortar carrier, as an engineering vehicle, anything you need on the battlefield that's got to keep up with the tanks you can stick in the back of the old M3 half-track. You stick a new engine in it, nice fresh diesel engine, and you do what you like with the old M3 because it's such a useful idea.
For many, the M3 has become the infantry fighting vehicle. Marks for service length are strong, as is its production rating. Mobility and carrying capability are medium, but innovation is low. But that's good enough to earn the M3 the number 8 spot on our list. Next up, the oldest and smallest vehicle in the bunch, but with a big heart, it became an unsung hero of the British Army. The British Universal Carrier. Manufacturer, Thornycroft. Power plant, 1 Ford 85 brake horsepower engine. Maximum speed, 48 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 4 troops. Armor, 0.89 centimeters. Armament, 1.303 machine gun. Range, 209 kilometers. After the stalemate of trench warfare during World War I, Britain decided it needed a fast, mobile troop carrier that could take the fight to the enemy over any terrain. The result was unveiled in 1934, the British Universal Carrier.
You ever seen a universal carrier? It is an almost comically tiny little thing. It looks like a toy, and it's dwarfed by a couple of strapping soldiers sitting in it. It looks bizarre, but what it does is it enables you to move around the battlefield over all kinds of terrain, the kind of thing that in the old days you'd slap on a horse.
The Universal Carrier soon acquired a nickname after the .303 machine gun it carried.
Most Brits call it the Bren gun carrier after the weapon system which it carried, but it also carried things like the Boys anti-tank rifle and could pull trailers and things like 6-pounder anti-tank weapons. So I think that the Bren carrier is a typical example of British ingenuity in that period at the end of the 1930s when there was no money to rearm.
And when, in 1939, World War II began, the little 3.5 meters long Bren gun carrier with a top speed of 48 kilometers per hour carried British troops into battle.
There must have been several thousand that went to France in 1940 to try and support the French army in the event of a German invasion. When the Germans did invade, a lot of the equipment, in fact, the bulk of the British army in France, most of the kit was left there, whether that was field guns or rifles or Bren gun carriers. Now, the Germans, being equally technically minded, saw the potential of this vehicle and pushed it into service.
As the war progressed, the universal carrier was adapted, from troop carrier to flamethrower, from mortar platform to ambulance. It went everywhere, and with the ability to be airlifted, it could get there in a hurry. It seemed that there was nothing that the universal carrier could not do.
In just about every theatre of war, particularly Northwest Europe and the North African desert, this is the vehicle you had to have. It almost became a status symbol.
It was a clear attempt to really do something that was, to a certain extent, transformational. Early on, to try and mechanize, if you will, infantry forces to a large extent, to provide a way of moving, other than trucks and cars, material, supplies, troops, command and control elements, officer, whatever, into the fight and through the fight. The idea was a great one.
By the end of the war, nearly 100,000 of these sturdy little fighters had been built, and the universal carrier remained in service until the mid-1950s. So it scores high on our matrix for production rating, as it does for innovation and service length. Marked down for its carrying capability and mobility rating, its scores are strong enough to earn 7th place on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Next up, a Cold War carrier from the Soviet Union that changed the shape of fighting vehicle design. The Soviet Bronovaya Mashina Piechota BMP-1. Manufacturer Kurgan Mashovat JSC. Power plant UTD 300 horsepower diesel engine. Max speed 63 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity 3 crew and 8 troops. Armor 3.3 centimeters. Armament: 1 73mm cannon, 1 7.62mm machine gun. Range 600 kilometers. During the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War arms race, the Soviet Union introduced the Bronovaya Mashina Piechota, or BMP-1. The BMP-1 represented a conceptual shift from armored personnel carrier to infantry fighting vehicle. It combined high-mobility anti-tank weapons with armored protection for onboard troops.
BMP-1 really was revolutionary. The idea was the father to all the other modern infantry fighting vehicles. I mean, this was a vehicle that truly made the transition from just being a carrier of infantry troops and other things to actually being a self-contained armored fighting vehicle as well.
And it was designed with one particularly revolutionary feature. For the first time in infantry fighting vehicle design, the BMP had a roof that could protect its troops. As soon as it was revealed in 1967, the BMP sent shivers of fear through the Western Allies.
It was the nightmare of every NATO commander in Northwest Europe to have thousands of these vehicles full of Warsaw Pact soldiers coming at them because they would be difficult to engage the infantry. So yes, I think in overall terms, this was a milestone vehicle.
With its 73mm cannon, 7.62mm machine gun, and the ability to fire anti-tank heat missiles with stabilizing fins, It seemed that the Soviets were onto a winner.
When the infantry is carried into battle and through the battle, safer because they're in an armored hull, and that armored hull can also shoot back at your tanks. So this really said that the Soviets were really going to one-up us in the kind of massive armored battles that we expected to see in Europe during the Cold War.
Another innovation that the BMP boasted was the ability for troops to fight within the vehicle, rather than having to dismount and lose the protection of its armor.
Little teardrop-shaped ports on the side allowed the soldiers inside to protrude their AK-47s out and shoot. Certainly gives a good sense of security to the soldier inside, but perhaps not the most practical thing as you're speeding by the enemy and without really a lot of visual reference.
Whilst the BMP revolutionized armored warfare, it was not without flaws. The armor was thin, and the low profile made it cramped for crew and passengers. But in trying to fix the cabin space problem, Soviet designers made a critical oversight.
It's interesting when you look at armored fighting vehicle design, even logistics vehicles designs, that people do some fundamentally stupid things.
If you open up the back of a BMP-1, you see that the rear doors seem really, really thick. And you wonder, wow, is that some kind of super thick armor meant to protect the guys inside? No, it's a fuel tank. And if a BMP takes a round up the backside, in particular if it takes an incendiary round up the backside, everybody inside is showered with burning fuel and everybody dies.
The BMP-1's vulnerability was laid bare by the serious losses suffered by the Egyptian and Syrian forces using it in the Arab-Israeli conflict of October 1973. Its successor, the BMP-2, has seen combat in many major hotspots, used by both the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's forces in Iraq. It's not known exactly how many BMPs were built, but it's probably in the tens of thousands, so it scores high for production rating, as it does for service length. It also earns good marks for mobility and carrying capability. Its innovation score is down due to some basic design flaws, but the BMP is still strong enough to earn a solid 6th place on our list. Coming up, a serious war machine that helped move Hitler's panzer divisions across Europe during the Nazi invasion, and a British carrier that's earned the right to be called a warrior, as the countdown to the #1 fighting vehicle continues. Halfway through our countdown of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles, this next personnel carrier paved the way for all others, transporting German troops during the Nazi invasion across Europe. The German Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251, manufacturer Hanomag, power plant Maybach 100 brake horsepower petrol engine, max speed 53 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 10 troops. Range, 180 kilometers. Armor, 1.5 centimeters. Armament, 2 7.92mm machine guns. During the 1930s, when many countries were frantically rearming, the German army began developing its new theory of lightning strike tactics known as Blitzkrieg.
Heinz Guderian, the German commander who becomes essentially the inventor of the Panzer Division, says that within a division, within a Panzer Division, you must have tanks, but you must also have infantry who can keep up with the tanks, the Panzer Grenadiers.
From this strategy came one of the most important fighting vehicles of its time, the Hanomag 251 half-track.
It was the forerunner of everything else that came behind it in the way of infantry carrying vehicles, and also because of the quality of the design. I mean, it may have been over-designed in terms of what was needed for a world war, but the design itself was innovative and, sexy and superb.
Initially armed with 2 7.92mm machine guns and protected by 1.5 centimeters of armor, the 251 swept across Europe and Russia, supporting the Nazi panzer brigades.
If you've got an all-arms division based around the tank, it does you no good if the tanks go racing across the country with their big trucks able to cross sand or swamp, and they leave their supporting infantry behind.
The German army used the Hanomag 251 in every major battle it fought during World War II. With a unique, sophisticated track system, its cross-country ability was outstanding. But the 251 was a victim of its own success.
Their half-tracks were extremely expensive to manufacture. They all lacked a powered front axle. And their track system used an interleaved road wheel arrangement, which is quite prone to clogging with mud or stones. And the tracks were a lubricated track, which required a lot of maintenance. So for constant cross-country use, the vehicle was very difficult to maintain.
Maintenance difficulties aside, over 20 different variants of the Hanomag 251 were produced. From anti-tank, anti-aircraft vehicle to a field ambulance and a mobile gun platform. There was even a rocket launcher variant known as the Infantry Stuka or Howling Cow. It seemed that there was nothing that the Hanomag 251 couldn't do.
In terms of innovation, the Hanomag, I think, is excellent because it does demonstrate that you can create vehicles that can keep up with the logistics support that you need for main battle tanks. And from that sprang other designs in other countries. So it's a benchmark vehicle.
By the end of the war, over 16,000 Hanomag 251s had been built. A variant was used by the Czech army until the late 1970s. Because of this, its production rating is high, as is its innovation factor. Its service length score is also good, with marks for mobility and carrying capability just as strong. So, the Hanomag 251 half-track easily earns its number 5 spot on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. This next vehicle could be called the latest recruit into the US Army. The M1126 Stryker Infantry Carrier Vehicle. Manufacturer, General Dynamics Land Systems. Power plant, 1 Caterpillar 350 horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 100 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 9 troops. Armor, classified. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun, 1 40mm grenade launcher. Range, 502 kilometers. With a top speed of 100 kilometers per hour and weighing in at nearly 19 tons, the 8-wheel Stryker is the first wheeled combat armored vehicle the American Army has had since World War II. But this is no ordinary newcomer. As soon as it was introduced into service in Iraq in December 2003, the Stryker began to make a name for itself.
The Iraqi insurgents have given it a bit of high praise. They call it the Shadow because unlike armored vehicles, they clank, they roar when the engines go. You can hear them coming. They have been surprised in a number of engagements when the Stryker shows up because it shows up essentially silently, or at least very quietly.
Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the American military faced many new challenges. They needed a modern, highly mobile infantry carrier that would take them into the 21st century. The result was the Stryker. Originally adapted from the same stable as the Marines' LAV-25, the Stryker was at first criticized for its vulnerability in having wheels instead of tracks.
If you're going to have a medium or high mobility vehicle that operates on roads, if you're going to have wheels, you have to accept the fact that some things are vulnerable. Even main battle tanks are vulnerable. But I think the great thing about Stryker is that you can run away, or you can maneuver, or you can replace and repair. So nothing is perfect in this world. But in terms of a balance of capabilities, Stryker comes well up in my estimation.
With its computerized cockpit and the ability to carry 2 crew members and 9 troops over a range of 480 kilometers, This rapid response vehicle gets the job done over almost any terrain.
Well, it certainly has greater speed than all the other vehicles we have in our arsenal. On most terrain, it has, in fact, greater mobility than tracked vehicles. The real debate comes down to soft terrain, marshy terrain, perhaps in winter, whether tracks, because the way tracks work to distribute the weight of a vehicle versus tires is where tracked vehicles have an advantage. But for most of the terrain we're looking at, under most circumstances, it actually operates better than tracked vehicles.
And with the ability to be transported via C-130 aircraft, this vehicle can now be placed right in the center of the action at a moment's notice. The Stryker has become so indispensable to the American military that it now has entire units formed around it, known as Stryker brigades.
We've been able to maneuver Stryker units almost across the length of Iraq. The brigade is based in the north, and we've actually brought battalions down 350 miles in a single day to engage in combat. So it's been a very effective system, and it's saved a lot of lives.
With over 2,000 Strykers ordered, this 21st century fighting vehicle has a strong production rating. Innovation and carrying capability mark it higher, but marks for mobility and service length are down. Still, it earns 4th place on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Next, a machine that has earned Britain the respect of her enemies. One that more than lives up to its name. The British MCV-80 Warrior. Manufacturer, GKN Defence. Power plant, 1 Perkins 550 brake horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 75 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 3 crew and 7 troops. Armor, classified. Armament, 1 30mm Radon cannon, 1 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. Range, 663 kilometers. During the 1970s, as the Cold War was reaching its climax, the British military brass wanted an infantry fighting vehicle that could compete with the Soviet BMP-1 and 2. They demanded something that could carry 10 troops and their supplies, be mobile enough to keep up with the British Challenger Mark I tank, and be able to sustain hits from small arms fire and indirect artillery shell bursts. In 1987, they got their wish when the MCV-80 Warrior went into service.
It serves the dual use of carrying troops that can fire and has its own armament for engaging in combat, and a much better design than anything that the Soviet Union put out, and allowed then for a combined arms team in the British military to essentially be created.
And that ability was demonstrated in 1991 during the First Gulf War. Capable of speeds in excess of 74 kilometers per hour, and with a range of almost 650 kilometers over any terrain, this vehicle safely carried its troops to the front lines. Throughout the conflict, the Warrior suffered no casualties from enemy fire. But it was during NATO peacekeeping missions in Bosnia and Kosovo that the 25-ton Warrior truly made its mark.
It's quite nice to have a great, big, intimidating-looking tracked vehicle to drive around in, because the locals know you mean business. And Warrior is a tall, harsh-looking piece of equipment that says to the locals that when our helmet's off and the soft cap is on, we're your friend, don't make us into your enemy.
In 2004, during the most recent conflict in Iraq, the Warrior demonstrated its ability to take punishment. Caught in a fierce firefight, its driver managed to get the vehicle out of harm's way and save the lives of his badly wounded troops. For this action, the driver was awarded Britain's highest military honor, the Victoria Cross.
That says a lot about the Warrior, because from my understanding, we're talking about a vehicle that had something like 14 hits from RPG-7s. A vehicle that the driver was very confident with, that had the right mobility, had the right capabilities at the right time. It's something that people trust. And in the battlefield, there are very few things you trust.
Earning the respect of those that have fought with and against it, the Tough Warrior is now the standard vehicle of the British Armed Forces and will remain so for the foreseeable future.
You could not have a modern conventional military without a vehicle of that type.
So, on our matrix, the Warrior scores high on carrying capability and mobility. It also earns strong marks for service length. But with only 789 built, its production rating lets it down, as does its innovation score. Still, its scores are strong enough to put it firmly into third place on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Next, a vehicle that started life badly, but now takes its troops right into the face of battle and packs a powerful punch. The M2 Bradley. Manufacturer, FMC Corporation. Power plant, one Cummins 500 horsepower turbocharged diesel engine. Maximum speed, 66 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 3 crew and 7 troops. Armor, classified. Armament, one Hughes 25mm chain gun, one 7.62mm machine gun, 2 anti-tank missile launchers. Range, 483 kilometers. In 1981, at the direct request of the US Army, the M2 Bradley entered service to replace the aging M113 and counter the threat from the Soviet BMP, with improved armor on top of an aluminium hull, armed with a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun and a top speed of almost 70 kilometers per hour. It seemed that the Bradley had it all. But there were serious doubts about its effectiveness as a fighter.
Bradley was designed to be a replacement for M113. Instead, Bradley turns into the all-singing, all-dancing armored vehicle that can't do anything in particular very well.
Well, the Bradley has sort of a spotted history. It was developed over a very long period of time in the United States, and there were a lot of cost overruns. It had to fill, I think, too many roles.
Some felt that the massive 25-ton, almost 3 meters tall Bradley was just too big for its own good.
The height of these vehicles can be a problem, and it can also be a virtue in terms of the ability to see from higher up. You get a better angle, potentially can even surprise an adversary. On the other hand, the higher you are, the higher your silhouette, the more of a target you can become.
In 1991 in Iraq, many of these doubts were dispelled. With its 25mm chain gun that fires depleted uranium rounds, this powerful vehicle knocked out more Iraqi armor during the First Gulf War than the 120mm guns of America's Abrams tanks. Throughout the 90s, the Bradley was constantly upgraded, and when it went into combat during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the ugly duckling had transformed into a fearsome fighter.
It really proved itself, I think, in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Bradley-equipped forces kept up with the armor, were right there at the head of the advance, engaged every one of the Iraqi units, and really protected the troops inside extremely well against the full range of attacks, from mines and IEDs through RPGs, artillery, mortars, and both anti-tank missiles and heavy guns.
With its new, improved laminate armor and digital fire and targeting systems, the Bradley has come of age as the 21st century fighting infantry vehicle.
This armour is so effective that in the first 4 months of 2005, of over 100 hits on Bradleys, there's only one Bradley which has sustained casualties. And that vehicle was hit twice in the same place where the reactive armour tiles had already been expended. Now, I think that says a lot about the vehicle.
After an uneasy start, the Bradley is now a state-of-the-art modern technological infantry fighting vehicle and will remain in operation with the US Army for the foreseeable future. It scores high on our matrix for both service length and mobility. Marks for carrying capability and innovation are high as well, and with over 7,000 built, the production rating is also strong. So the Bradley rightly earns the number 2 spot on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. Only one vehicle remains, the creme de la creme, an armoured personnel carrier that has stood the test of time and rightly deserves the number 1 spot. Continuing our countdown of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles of all time. Finally, the best of the best. A vehicle that stood the test of time and rightly deserves the top spot on our list. The M113 Armoured Personnel Carrier. Manufacturer, United Defence LP. Power plant, Detroit 212 horsepower diesel engine. Maximum speed, 68 kilometers per hour. Carrying capacity, 2 crew and 10 troops. Armor, 4.4 centimeters. Armament, 1.50 caliber machine gun. Range, 483 kilometers. After World War II had shown the need for an armored personnel carrier for infantry, it became obvious that a fully tracked, highly mobile, amphibious and air transportable vehicle was needed. The M113 answered all these requirements. In 1960, it entered service with the US Army.
It's an armored box with treads, and so there's a lot of space that you can fill up for everything from an ambulance to an infantry vehicle to a mortar carrier to command and control, nuclear biological detection, whatever you want to use it for.
With the ability to carry 2 crew members and 10 troops at a top speed of 68 kilometers per hour over all terrain, the M113 was called into every American military hotspot.
This is a classic vehicle. Innovation in the terms of its design, the way it was built, mass production, the way it came out of experiences not just in the Second World War and Korea, but also had bits of, if you like, of Vietnam inserted in it as well. This is a vehicle that you cannot see any footage of any trouble spot in the world almost without coming across at least one of them.
Armed with a 50 caliber machine gun, the M113 was soon entrenched in the Vietnam War. But with the escalation of that conflict, some serious problems with its aluminium armor began to show.
M113 is designed to protect infantry from small arms while they're getting to and from the place where they're meant to fight. M113 is, for lightness, armored in aluminum, which means that you can protect yourself against up to 7.62 millimeter Soviet rounds, and that's about it. If you fire an RPG round at aluminum armor, you create a jet of essentially burning poison that shoots into the compartment and kills everybody inside.
But with continual upgrades and refinements, including strengthened armor, the M113 continued to frustrate America's enemies.
A later development was the so-called ACAV, or Air Cavalry version, when a rounded turret structure was constructed over the commander's cupola and a 50 caliber machine gun was mounted within it. And generally it wouldn't contain any soldiers except for those on top firing the weapons. And in that role, it very much succeeded.
Succeed it did. For over 4 decades, the M113 has been at the forefront of the US Armed Services and has proven itself across the globe, including the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In addition to its basic personnel carrier role, the M113 has been used as a mortar carrier, command control, anti-aircraft, and flamethrower vehicle. It has also been adapted to carry America's Lance and Chaparral missiles. With over 80,000 built and exports to nearly 50 countries, nothing is too much for this fighting vehicle.
If you look at the world distribution of armoured personnel carriers in the post-war era, you can hardly find a country in the Western world that doesn't have M113s. So much so, in fact, that second-hand M113s are still as popular today as they were, 40 years ago when the vehicle first came into service.
Despite the introduction of more modern specialized infantry vehicles like the Bradley IFV and the Humvee, the M113 is still going strong and will probably be one of the most widely used armored vehicles ever built.
It probably will last it several decades further. And if you can say I've got a vehicle that will last, has lasted and will last somewhere in the order of 75 or 80 years, that puts it on, I think, anybody's list.
So, how did the M113 score on our matrix? With over 40 years on the front lines, service length, excellent. With over 80,000 built, production rating, outstanding. Marks for innovation, high. With the ability to move 10 troops through harm's way, marks for carrying capability are also high, as is its all-terrain mobility rating. All of which puts the M113 firmly in first place on our list of the top 10 infantry fighting vehicles. So there it is. 10 personnel carriers that have changed the face of military warfare and history. But it's the M113 with over 40 years of service, an incredible production record of over 80,000 built, and the ability to be ready for action for decades to come that earns the title of the greatest infantry fighting vehicle of all time.